The omission of history, and especially the history of colonialism and war, is a constant in the mythology determined to transform all communist and anti-colonialist leaders into Hitler's twin monsters, more or less. This is quite an easy task with Pol Pot. And it's therefore worthwhile to dwell on him, certainly not to rehabilitate him or to reconsider the dimension of the horrors for which he became responsible, but with the aim of better clarifying the ways with which the dominant mythology today is constructed. In doing this, I will make almost exclusive use of a book by an American scholar on Asia and a monograph about Cambodia written by a journalist who worked for The Times, The Economist, and the BBC. We therefore start by asking one question: when and how did the tragedy that culminated in the horrors of the Pol Pot regime start? Here's an initial answer, offered by the American scholar, quote, "At the start of the 1970s, President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger ordered a bombing campaign against rural Cambodia that included more bombs than had been dropped on Japan during World War II, killing at least 750,000 Cambodians. 973 unquote. The figure that appears in the monograph on Pol Pot's Cambodia is more cautious. The number of victims reached 500,000. However, it's evident that the bombs fell en masse, and especially on the civilian population, which was decimated, with the survivors' bodies often horrendously wounded, and at any rate traumatized by the daily experience of the terror bombings and by the escape from the countryside to the cities in the hands of government troops, and therefore spared of the inferno, but increasingly subjected to the chaos that following the growing influx of refugees, forced to endure a precarious existence on the brink of starvation. By the end of the war, in the capital alone there were 2 million displaced people, and they were housed in shacks and slums, with the sick and injured housed in hospitals, but with little hope for survival. 974. To all of this it must be added the large-scale massacres carried out by the troops led by Lon Nol, who comes to power in 1970 with a coup d'état engineered by Washington. Here's how the regime backed by the U.S., supported with hundreds of millions of dollars, confronts the problem represented by ethnic minorities. In the Vietnamese villages to the north of Phnom Penh, at least 3,000 residents, all males above the age of 15, were rounded up and taken to the river bank and then shot dead. The women that remained were raped. Or, in the region called Parrots Peak, the prisoners in the camp were warned of an imminent Viet Cong attack and were given the order to flee. While they ran, the Cambodian guards opened fire with their machine guns. Those are only two examples. Authoritative journalists recall their impression that having visited places similar to the one we just saw, it looked like a slaughterhouse, and it had the smell of a slaughterhouse. 975. Let it be clear, the fury of Lon Nol's troops didn't just target the Vietnamese. The communists taken prisoner were often eliminated. Moreover, those responsible for those deaths enjoyed being photographed while they showed off, proud and smiling, the severed heads of guerrillas. 976. On the other hand, it would wrong to exclusively blame Asians for the atrocities that took place in Cambodia, and more generally in Indochina. Consider the story by an American teacher, told in American magazine, about a CIA agent who lived in Laos in a house decorated with a collection of ears pulled from the heads of dead communists. 977. At this point a new question must be asked: is there a connection between the first act of the Cambodian tragedy and the ones that follow? In attempting to minimize that relationship, the book that I cited is not without contradictions and oscillations. It's possible that the bombing campaigns had contributed to an atmosphere that would lead to extremism. But the ground war would have caused that, in any case. Was the ground war inevitable? Shouldn't we start with the war itself? The equation no Vietnam War, no Khmer Rouge is too simplistic, but it reflects an undeniable truth. 978. The British journalist has trouble admitting, despite his inconvenient logic, that those primarily responsible for the tragedy have to be sought out in Washington. And from his reporting emerges a truth that's inconvenient to the simplifications that are commonplace today. Here's how the monograph on Cambodia reports the conquest of Phnom Penh by the guerrillas. After all that had happened, it could have been much, much worse. 979. At least with regard to the very first phase of holding power, there's a moderation in Pol Pot that could hardly be found in Washington's leaders. On the other hand, the new rulers were facing real and dramatic difficulties. Will the U.S. begin a new round of terror bombing? And how to feed an urban population that had grown too much, with agriculture devastated by the transformation of the countryside into a lunar landscape? And how to face the CIA threat which in the cities had installed secret radio transmitters and clandestine spy cells? 980. Certainly, Pol Pot's extremist and messianic populism was also behind the decision to evacuate the cities, but that very behavior is driven by the sight of terribly overcrowded cities, exposed to the enemy threat and surrounded by chaos, with a large part of the population unable to play any productive role. To conclude, why should the moral judgment on Pol Pot be more severe than the one on Nixon and Kissinger? The same British author I've repeatedly cited, while on the one hand he rejects the intentionalist explanation for the massacres to which Pol Pot's adventure lead, that was never the political line of the KCP, that is the Cambodian Communist Party. The objective wasn't to destroy, but to transform. On the other hand, he observes regarding the ferocity of the American war, the bombing campaigns had turned into a symbol of virility. 981. It must be added that, after seizing power, and during the war with Vietnam that follows, Pol Pot is supported politically and diplomatically by the U.S. However, ruling class ideology remains silent on the crucial and decisive role by Nixon and Kissinger in the Cambodian tragedy. It's well known that the barbarians are always outside the West. If political leaders must be criminalized, it's those responsible for the revolution, never those responsible for the war. That hypocrisy is even more repugnant for the fact that, while the torture and killing by Pol Pot comes to an end, the full weight of the American war and all its impacts continue to be felt. Throughout Indochina there's people dying of hunger, disease and unexploded projectiles. 982. At least with respect to Vietnam, it's necessary to have in mind the figure reached a while ago by a conservative French paper according to which, 30 years after the end of hostilities, there were still 4 million victims disfigured by the terrible Agent Orange. 983. And in Cambodia? Let's put aside the devastating physical injuries. How many Cambodians still suffer from the devastating and irreversible psychological damage caused by the bombing campaign? 984. One conclusion is unavoidable: to concentrate exclusively on Pol Pot means being satisfied with a half-truth, which in reality ends up constituting a complete lie, guilty of remaining silent on those principally responsible for the horrors.